Paul Templar had guided clients along the Zambezi River for years, long enough to know that calm water could still be lethal. He understood how the river hid danger beneath a smooth surface, how sandbars shifted, and how animals defended invisible boundaries. Hippos were the most dangerous presence on that stretch of water. They could look like rounded boulders, half submerged, barely moving, and then surge with explosive force. On March 9, 1996, Paul was leading a canoe safari near Mana Pools in Zimbabwe, a route he knew well. The group moved steadily downstream, canoes spaced apart and voices kept low. Earlier that morning, Paul had pointed out pods of hippos and reminded everyone to stay quiet and keep distance. Hippos did not hunt people, but they reacted violently to intrusion and to commotion. One mistake could be fatal. The river otherwise felt controlled, paddles dipping in rhythm, the guides constantly checking angles and spacing. A radio call shattered that calm. A guide ahead reported shouting and splashing. One canoe had drifted too close to a pod of hippos. A large animal surged upward and flipped the boat, throwing 2 people into the water. Paul turned immediately and paddled hard toward the disturbance, shouting instructions to keep the rest of the group together and alert. He could already hear the panic in voices up ahead. He knew the risk. Swimmers triggered Hippo's most aggressive reactions, and confusion made it worse. But leaving people in the water was not an option. As he closed the distance, Paul scanned for ripples and bubbles, for the faint swell that meant something heavy was rising below. He tried to keep the boats tight enough to help each other, but not so tight they would drift into the pod. He reached the swimmers first and pulled them toward nearby canoes. Hands grabbed arms and life vests, hauling bodies out. As the rescue was nearly complete, the water beside Paul bulged violently. A full-grown hippo erupted from below, jaws opening wide enough to engulf his torso. The impact launched Paul from his canoe and into the animal's mouth. The pressure was instant and crushing. The hippo dragged him underwater and shook him with tremendous force. Teeth punched through muscle and bone as the animal bit repeatedly. Paul felt his body folding, his pelvis collapsing, his abdomen tearing. He understood he was being bitten nearly in half, and that the next seconds would decide whether he lived. He forced himself to stay conscious. Panic would end him faster than blood loss. Drawing on training and instinct, Paul pushed his arm deep into the hippo's throat, past the teeth, trying to trigger a gag reflex. The grip tightened, then loosened. He twisted and shoved, fighting for space where none should have existed. When the jaws slackened again, he used that moment, wrenching his body free as the water churned around him. The hippo surfaced and slammed him once more before releasing him. Paul broke the surface gasping, blood spreading across the water. He could not feel his legs. His lower body was mangled, and pain arrived in violent waves that threatened to black him out. The hippo circled aggressively as others dragged Paul into a canoe, shouting for paddles, shouting not to stop. The group paddled toward shore in a tight formation, fearing another strike. On land, the damage was undeniable. Paul's abdomen was open, his pelvis shattered, and he was losing blood rapidly. There was no hospital nearby, only radios, rough roads, and the knowledge that time was running out. Someone pressed cloth and hands to wounds while another called for evacuation, voice tight and controlled. A frantic transport began. Paul was loaded into a vehicle and driven to the nearest airstrip. Every jolt sent shock through his body. He focused on breathing and staying awake, listening to the engine, forcing his mind to stay present. At the strip, a small aircraft was waiting. It took off as soon as he was aboard, carrying him to Harare. At the hospital, surgeons worked for hours to remove destroyed tissue, repair internal injuries, and prevent infection. Paul survived the first night, then another. His right arm was so badly damaged, it required amputation. Doctors cautioned that survival did not guarantee recovery, and walking again was uncertain. In intensive care, machines tracked his heartbeat and oxygen, and staff watched for the subtle changes that signaled sepsis. In the days that followed, Paul drifted between awareness and sedation as his condition stabilized. He woke to bright lights, to voices explaining what had happened, to the sensation of bandages and tubes and the blunt reality of missing weight where his arm had been. Friends and colleagues from the river brought news of the people he had pulled from the water. They had survived. For Paul, that fact mattered, even through pain and medication. Recovery was long and punishing. Infection was a constant threat. Wounds had to be cleaned and checked. Pain management was careful but never complete. Physical therapists began with basic movements, breathing exercises, shifting in bed, sitting upright without collapsing. Later came standing with support, then short steps, then the exhausting work of rebuilding balance with a pelvis that had been crushed. Each gain was small, and each setback felt like it erased weeks. As weeks turned into months, rehabilitation became routine. Some days brought strength, others brought fevers, swelling, or fatigue that stopped everything. Paul confronted the psychological impact alongside the physical. Sleep could snap into dark, underwater moments where pressure returned and he was inside the jaws again. He learned to manage fear the way he had managed rivers, one decision at a time, one controlled breath at a time, refusing to surrender focus. Eventually, he left the hospital to continue rehabilitation outside its walls. Daily life revolved around therapy appointments, follow-up surgeries, and adapting to a permanently changed body. Simple tasks had to be relearned. Equipment had to be modified. Independence took planning. When Paul returned to the river environment, it was with caution and respect, aware of the risks, but unwilling to be driven away from the work that had shaped his life. As the months passed, the focus shifted from simply surviving complications to building a workable life. Therapy sessions stretched longer, concentrating on stamina and on protecting damaged joints from collapse. Doctors monitored scar tissue and circulation, adjusting treatment when swelling or infection flared. Paul learned new ways to handle basic routines, getting dressed, preparing food, climbing into a vehicle, tasks that had once been automatic. He worked through the frustration of dependence, then the slow return of control, measuring progress in what he could do unaided today that he could not do the week before. In conversations with other guides and conservation workers, he described the attack plainly and emphasized the same lesson he had always taught on the river: distance, discipline, and the understanding that a single lapse can turn an ordinary day into an emergency. Paul Templar survived one of the most violent animal attacks ever recorded because he stayed conscious, forced a release, and endured long enough to reach help. The injuries were permanent, but so was the fact that in the moment the river turned deadly, he moved toward danger to get others out. Thank you for listening to Horrifying Survival Stories. Subscribe for more stories of those who faced the impossible and lived.